My wife and I are having our first child in August, and homeschooling. Thank you. Homeschooling's always been an intention, um, or unschooling in some form, but obviously we're new to this, and I suspect many of the other people that you're talking about are who are listening to this are also new to this. So if we are new to this and it's our intention, where's the best place to start? And again, like for us, we have at least 2 years while they're very small that we don't have to be thinking about it, but it's good to start planning now. So where would we begin?
Well, maybe I'll start by sharing a little bit of my journey
Sure.
and then kind of how I came to choose homeschooling for my kids or unschooling for my kids. Um, when I was an undergraduate, I was an economics major in the late 1990s, but was increasingly interested in education policy, particularly from an economics lens, and in particular, the lack of choices that a lot of families had in terms of education. And for my senior year, I was able to do a research project on an education topic of my choice for an education class I was taking. And I decided to explore the idea of homeschooling. And I went to K to 12 public schools. I never knew a homeschooler. This again was the late 1990s. As I mentioned earlier, homeschooling had just become legally recognized in all US states a few years prior. So it was still a relatively new phenomenon. In fact, the US Department of Education only began tracking homeschoolers in 1999, counting 850,000 at the time. So it was still really very much in the margins. And not at all the kind of mainstream option that it's become. But I was so curious about this other way of learning outside of conventional schooling. And I had a classmate who had a family member who lived nearby who was homeschooling and invited me to shadow them for the semester to see, what homeschooling was like. What is it like to learn outside of a conventional classroom? And I remember walking into that family's home and just being completely captivated by what I saw. The child was 8 years old at the time, and she was just so curious and creative and at ease with adults and confident. Interestingly, my first question to the mom was, well, what about socialization? Which I sort of cringe at now that I asked that question, but of course it is sort of the gut,
It's the
the
first
gut
question
question.
everyone who homeschools gets.
But it was very quickly, it very quickly became apparent to me that this child was authentically socialized. She was being social in her community, taking advantage of all of these community networks and classes and extracurricular programs and interacting with people of all different ages and all different ways in a really authentic way. And what was most striking to me was that same semester I was also doing a student teaching practicum at a local public elementary school, which I hadn't really thought much about until I started to see this homeschool child, and the ages were about the same, second grade. And I, for the first time, was really able to see this stark contrast between this traditional, conventional style of schooling, age segregated classrooms, a standardized curriculum, a real focus on order and compliance and obedience, and what we would think of as socialization in that way, and this genuine socialization that this homeschool child was having by just being fully immersed in the people, places, and things around her. And I think that was really the image that stuck with me and certainly remained with me. After college, I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard and continued to be interested in education options, education choice, homeschooling always being in the back of my mind. And then when, sort of a decade later, I was looking at education options for my own children, I could have remembered those images of, what is the kind of social environment I want for my child? What is the kind of learning environment I want for, at that time, my oldest daughter? And I realized that, if I had sent her to school, her learning really would have contracted. She would go from really this kind of robust immersion in our community and going to the library and museums and interacting with friends and people of all different ages and stages to being in an age segregated classroom with the same peer group of students and the same kind of static handful of teachers, the same building every day. And to me, that just seemed like I would be, or my husband and I would be, limiting her education as opposed to expanding it. And so that's what ultimately, led us to decide to homeschool. And then I'll sort of, I'm sort of long-winded response, but I'll sort of end with in the early years, kind of her preschool years, she was learning in a very self-directed way, following her interests and really, being very curious and us being able to connect her interests with various resources. And then I remember as my daughter reached kindergarten age, and I said, really, we have to start getting serious about her, formal learning. So I started researching various curriculum that would teach her the 3 R's, make sure, that she learned how to read and do basic numeracy and all of this. And as I was sort of thinking about, spending thousands of dollars on curriculum or finding the one that would be the best fit, out of nowhere, she taught herself how to read. And I thought, maybe maybe I'll hold off on this curriculum right now and just see, what else we can do. She was still little. Let's just see how kindergarten goes. And sure enough, as you'll discover, and I'm sure you've seen in other aspects of your life, kids are incredibly curious when they're young, and they're always asking questions, and they're always eager to learn new things and to know new things. And if all we need to do as parents is to cultivate that creativity and that curiosity. But what so often happens is we send them to school and that creativity gets halted. They sort of learn that conformity is valued over creativity and obedience is valued over originality. And so all of that kind of natural exuberance for learning and discovery that young children have can often get eroded when they enter into a formal classroom environment.
I know as someone who works in a collaborative field in the arts, I definitely had to unlearn certain emotional lessons taught during high school group projects. That there's just, because when people talk about socialization and children needing to go to school to learn, they don't realize they're also learning emotional lessons and lessons about how they relate to other people. And so you mentioned the socialization question, which is something that I think everyone who considers homeschooling or unschooling gets asked about. What is the way to allow your children to get the socialization that is best for them or that will serve them the most? Because one of the things that, having a kid is making me think about is like, okay, what group of people am I socializing them into? Like, what group of people do I want around my kids who they're going to be unconsciously picking up habits from? I look at the images now post-COVID of kids being put in these like sort of weird plastic bubbles or having police officers stand over them to make sure they're wearing their mask at school. And I think I probably don't want them socialized into that. But what instead of that do I want, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a good point. And I think, again, parents taking a look at what was happening in their children's schools, and then certainly the back to school guidelines with social distancing and all day mask wearing and these plastic barricades. I think a lot of parents said, that's not really a great learning environment. I think we can do something better, at least temporarily. And then many of them discovered, hey, this is actually much more rewarding and feasible than I originally thought. Let's continue. But the socialization question is important, and I think it's really just great to know that there are so many homeschooling resources in really every area. So this kind of gets back, I think, to your earlier question of what are the sort of the first steps. And I would say, early on, connect with local homeschooling communities. My oldest daughter was, I think, 2 years old when I first connected with our local homeschool community. We still have friends that we met that year, when we first started going to homeschool park days or outings with other homeschooling families. And now there are just so many more homeschoolers. And then even within, because the homeschooling rate has increased so much and there's so many more homeschoolers, I think you're able to find your, like-minded cohort more easily, and you're able to join various Facebook groups in your local area or listservs or other kind of social networks and figure out, kind of who do you mesh with and what are the learning opportunities available to you and your children. And there's a whole assortment. So in my Unschooled book, I profile a lot of the self-directed learning centers and the I call them unschooling schools, but democratic schools like the Sudbury Valley model of schooling that really focuses on self-directed education. And these programs are really sprouting in all kinds of areas, mostly concentrated in urban areas, but really all over the country. And then there's also, if you don't want sort of the unschooling model, if you want something that's a little more traditional, but still, not kind of a typical schooling environment for your kids. There's classical model of education, and there's often kind of what are known as hybrid classical schools for families that involve, going to a kind of a brick and mortar center for a couple of days a week and then being able to be home another few days a week. In fact, EdChoice's Mike McShane just wrote a great book about hybrid homeschooling and how it's the future, what he thinks is the future of education. So I think we'll see more of those models as well and provide more options for families to find the right educational fit and philosophy for them and their child.
Thank you for listening. If you like this clip, please subscribe and share the show with someone else who would also like it. You can find the Brendon Marotta Show on all major podcast platforms and at brendonmarotta.com/show. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to share more with you in the future.